Thank you for having me here, and thanks for taking the time out of your lives to focus on wine, spirits, and to hopefully learn something. One of the things I think in approaching the language specifically as the theme and then looking at aged wines and how to talk about them versus younger wines, and thinking about that in a hospitality kind of sense where you're interacting with guests and your table side, and you want to be able to present things with a degree of grace and dignity in a way that makes it enticing, but also sets the context, because I think context is extremely important, particularly in restaurants, to sort of build the atmosphere around how they're going to experience the wine and to kind of bring the enthusiasm and joy and sort of some degree of insight or some of your own personal passion and excitement for the wine when someone orders something or when you make a recommendation to a guest. I think all of those things are really, really important. So one of the things I wanted to do really quickly with you, if you wouldn't mind, before we get started, just to sort of get your mind in the right frame, and also to kind of conjure up some of your own, so it's a little more personal for you, a little more engaging, conjure up some of your own personal language and words, and start thinking about how to describe something that's older, and like what that means versus something that's younger. And I think there's a lot of really wonderful analogies out there in order to do this. But if you look at the piece of paper I passed out on the back, the last page, on one side, so on one side is a picture of a grandma who looks kind of cool, and the other side is like a younger child jumping around. And so the reason why I put these two things, I think for everyone, you've all had an older person, a grandmother, or someone older in your life that you've known, and you have your own personal feelings, and it's very emotional, it's very personal, right? And I think wine at its very best, and when the people who are most expressive and most unique, and I think are best at sharing what wine is really about, what the experience can be about for someone when they're going to taste it, are people that can share something kind of intimate, kind of personal about that, and bring that to their guests through their language, through the way they do it. And then on the other side, you have this younger person. So I'm sure everyone's known someone younger in their life, a child, somebody, and it's definitely a distinctively different experience of interacting with a younger child. And there's a lot of nuance to it, and I think everyone has their own personal experience with that. So if you would, write down on each side of it your own personal description of that type of relationship of like how either it makes you feel, or how you would describe that child, or how you would describe that grandmother or grandfather or whoever, and some of the things that make that relationship special. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you do this as well as you write, I just wanted to comment a little bit more, is that for me, and I think, the more I read, the more I learn, the more really amazing wine professionals I've been able to meet, winemakers, viticulturalists, you find it becomes so much less for some of the most experienced people about the really sort of canned, it's this fruit, or it's this, it's got acidity, and it's got the, and there's a lot of like canned language around wine, and you have tons of wonderful guests throughout all of the restaurants, and you have really interesting wine lists. And I think also the environment that each restaurant creates is really engaging. And so I think you all obviously know, I experienced this coming into your restaurants, is that you feel like open, you feel warm, you feel welcome, and you also feel like you're able to be vulnerable with your server, bartender, whoever. You can say like, oh, what do you think I should try for wine? Or I'm kind of feeling like this, or people describe different moods and stuff that they're in. And I think analogies to different aspects in life can often be the most interesting things. And I find that with really great wine professionals, they have this tremendous ability with their language to convey those really unique and sometimes personal, but sometimes very, very specific, very spot on kind of analogies to bring to light. The wine is really so much more than like the very simple descriptors that we give to them. It's obviously, it's magical because it is not just, fermented fruit, grape juice. It's really become something far more complex than just those things. If we were to look at the two wines on the table, I believe the left one is the younger, right? Okay, in the right. And when you taste these two wines, and to sort of bring some of that similar kind of context to that tasting experience, when you taste this younger wine, it's a little bit, has this exuberant sort of like earnestness to it, has this like, let me show you who I am, let me show you the fruit that I just, you know, I still have, it's all here, it's beautiful, I don't even have any wrinkles, I'm beautiful. And there's this like joyous kind of like excitement to it, and there's this fun and this kind of like energy to it. And I think that can even relate if you're with a table and they want to have fun and be silly and laugh. I mean, what's a good recommendation for a bottle of wine? Probably not something old and meditative and smells like mothballs and has like a sort of sedative effect to it, you know. So like I think like using like analogies like this can really help you sort of relate the environment and the context to the experience and help you generate your own language, because when being language as an overarching theme, I will say it's an incredibly difficult thing, because rather than, it would have been, I think, easy enough for me to come and give you like a list of terminology. You know, these are good for older wines, these are good for younger wines and stuff like that. And I think that's wonderful and that's brilliant. It probably works really well on like a sommelier exam and things like, and those are important things. But I think when you're in a restaurant setting, I've always found that this sort of language that's a little outside of that more technical experience and has more human characteristics maybe, or has more analogies built into it, can create a much more empowering experience for your guests. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what you want to be able to do, right? It's like you have wines on the list because they've been carefully chosen and they are really great for whatever vintage they are or whatever they are. But you want guests to be empowered, to feel excited, and to feel really super confident that what they're about to experience is going to be something that is going to be really joyful. But you also want to be able to guide them in a way that sets the context, so they know sort of to some extent, or at least you know what you're guiding them into, the type of experience you're guiding them into, and that the wine can over-deliver and provide them with like the maximum experience for that situation you're looking. Does that make any sense? I think the aromatics are really important, because aromatics are going to tell you a lot, and they're going to tell you a lot about age. They're going to tell you a lot about the general energy of the wine. Is it really kind of coming out of the glass? Is it effusive? Is it energized? Is it energetic? Does it have these really primary fruits? Because to me, wine can sometimes take on shapes and things, right? So like in younger wines, they have more defined fruit shapes and colors to me. There's really like bright colors. So sometimes they're like a deep greenish, bright neon. They're more like neon colors even. They have this more exuberant kind of energy to them. And so they're both Muscadet. For one, I should give you a little bit of information. Muscadet, and the grape is Melon de Bourgogne, from the Loire Valley. And I think this is I thought this would be also interesting to taste, because it's not always a wine you necessarily put in the category of like, oh, let's age this for a long time. But that being said, just to speak slightly to like a more technical component of it, I think there's a few different things that make wines age really well, and that's part of like a lot of the language that's on this sheet that you have. Is different categories to look at, like the body of the wine, the acidity of the wine, the tannin, some of those things, the sweetness levels, those kind of things. And I think acidity is one of the more important aspects of aging. And with Muscadet, there's certainly a depth of fruit that you get, like a density, so sort of a weight, and that translates into sort of the depth of the body. But the acidity can really help carry it through its life as it ages. And so when you taste them young, for me, I think there's a certain like degree of almost salinity to me here, where it's not super well defined like fruit characteristics. It's not like, oh, it's appley, or it's not one of these, one thing or the other. It has a kind of a briny, salty sea edge to it, almost like I would think of like those like sweet sea beans, if you've ever had those, and with this like kind of lushness behind it that has a generosity of fruit, maybe a little less defined in terms of fruit, but more like on the kiwi kind of almost softer melon kind of thing. And in the mid palate, there's a little bit of of freshness, like an openness to it. And then on the finish, I think you have this cleanliness and a little bit more of that stoniness that kind of follows through on the finish. So this is spent only 6 months in tank. And so the one directly to the right of it, that's 2010. Now it's not super old, but it's definitely, 6-7 years old now. This was in tank for 30 months and is built to maybe age a little bit longer. And just part of that aging a little bit longer, some of the things that they do in order to put it in that category is to harvest grapes that are maybe a little bit more fully ripe, maybe so. Not necessarily just like more sugar in the grapes, more ripe like that, but like the sugar and the acid is still really balanced when they harvest, but both of them are a little bit like more intense, right? So like the whole of the grape is more intense, I think there's sometimes an illusion that like you have a very ripe vintage and that's going to be the most ageable wines. Well, there's definitely some really interesting learning experiences I think wine regions, maybe like somewhere like Napa, have had, where it's like it's not just about being ripe. Ripe is really good, but those just a lot of sugar and alcohol in the wine don't necessarily give it age. You need some of those more tough, gritty kind of elements of it. It's kind of what, like when you think about the grandmother, grandfather, older person scenario, a lot of times there's this, like, as you were talking about, there's this kind of grit, right? There's this like strength, there's this like resolve, there's this kind of intensity that kind of makes that aging graceful, right? And so sometimes it's tannin, sometimes it's a lot of acidity, sometimes it's a degree of intensity that kind of holds the balance of the rest of the wine in flux. It's also not a cut and dry thing. That's partly why it's like it may seem like a little bit like of a fluffy thing here, because there's not a hard and fast set of rules. Okay, it's not like this wine's going to age and this wine's not. Oh, and this region's going to age and this is not. It's not super cut and dry like that. It's a biological product. It's got tons of like enzymes and it's a living, breathing thing. So as it evolves, the way it's stored matters. The harvest, the vintage, the way it was fermented, a lot of those things really come into play. So it requires being intuitive in understanding the wine quite well. So it's hard to do sort of in a vacuum, but obviously someone tasted the wine to put it on your list, so you can trust that it's really good. If not, you actually get a chance to taste it. That's even better. Then you really get a strong sense of it. I think what makes this wine age particularly well, though, obviously, is the acidity for me. The acidity stands up. And I think, just to kind of give you a little bit of a primer before any of you kind of share, is that like when Muscadet ages, the thing that keeps it really sort of dynamic and interesting in its age is not that it's got this lush fruit. It's some of those things that you talk about with like this young child, exuberant, fresh fruit, fun, great, but it's not necessarily those things that carry it through. It's like when you taste this, there's a mellowness to the body of it, right? It kind of softens and it kind of comes a little bit more sort of deep. There's like, it brings you kind of into the glass a little deeper. There's a mellowness kind of to the center of it, which makes you kind of like, almost, it makes me kind of like lean into the glass, like, oh, wait, there's something more there. And it's like, becomes a bit more dynamic, a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit more subtle. But at the same time, the finish of the wine has this great like acidity and lift and drive. It sort of carries it right through with this like boldness right through to the end of it. And that's really exciting with a style of wine like this that you often associate with just being drank really quick and fresh and easy.